To formally launch this event. There we are. Excellencies, dear colleagues, welcome to this event, launching the new flagship report from the PlastChem Project entitled State of the Science on Plastic Chemicals, Identifying and Addressing Chemicals and Polymers of Concern. We would like to start by congratulating the PlastChem Project team for the quality of their publication and for choosing the Geneva Bit Plastic Pollution Dialogues for the launch. These dialogues have kept the international community in Geneva and beyond engaged on this topic since the end of 2020, making links with various international processes. The dialogues are organized by the Geneva Environment Network in collaboration with the Basel, Rotterdam and Stockholm Convention Secretariat, the Center for International Environmental Law, the Global Governance Center at the Graduate Institute, IUCN, Norway, Switzerland, and the Forum on Trade and Environment and SDGs, known as TESS, and the University of Geneva. The third series of dialogues kick off after the adoption 2 years ago of the historical resolution at the United Nations Environment Assembly, setting up the path to a global treaty to end plastic pollution. The Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee to develop this international legally binding instrument that was set up following the adoption of the resolution will meet for its fourth session. We refer to this session as the INC4 in April in Ottawa, Canada. Many attendees today will be present in Ottawa next month. Taking place during the intersessional period ahead of this INC4 session, today's dialogue is co-organized with the PlastChem Project team and will provide a platform for stakeholders to discuss the latest state of science on plastic chemicals and polymers of concern and identify ways to address them. Before you are formally welcome, let me remind you that the documents presented, the summary, as well as the video of the event will be made available on the webpage of this event, and the link is being shared in the chat. Throughout the event, you can raise questions by using the Q&A box. We have a dedicated session to answer these after the presentations, if time allows. So moving now to the opening session of this event, we are delighted to be joined by Michel Chiron, who is the head of the Global Affairs section of the Swiss Federal Office for the Environment. Switzerland is a convener of the Geneva Bit Plastic Pollution Dialogues and a member of the High Ambition Coalition to End Plastic Pollution. And for the opening session, we are also joined by Jonas Enge of the Research Council of Norway. So after the welcoming remarks, David Azoulay, the director of the Geneva office and of the Environmental Health Program of the Center for International Environmental Law, will moderate the event. So it is our pleasure now to turn to Michel Chiron from Switzerland. Michel, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Diana. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the government of Switzerland, I would like to welcome you to this Geneva Environment Network event. It is a pleasure for me to speak to you in the opening of this session. And let me first thank the PlastChem report team for its important work and the Geneva Environment Network for organizing this session. Plastic pollution is a multifaceted challenge that requires a comprehensive response by addressing the full life cycle of plastics. Chemicals in plastics are a key aspect of the plastics crisis, and although a range of scientifically sound information is available, translating scientific data into concrete action remains a challenge. The information is often fragmented and hard to access. And more generally, as a general principle, it is key that policymakers are well informed and that we work with a robust scientific basis. The scientific information will guide us to take the right decisions in addressing global environmental challenges. To this end, it is very important that existing information is utilized as effectively as possible. And good examples for intergovernmental science policy processes are the IPCC and the IPBES in the areas of climate change and biodiversity. And currently, a third intergovernmental panel is being established, and it will cover the area of chemicals, waste, and pollution. And this new science policy panel could play an important role in synthesizing information about chemicals and plastics and inform an evidence-based policy development. With the many international organizations and environmental conventions, Geneva is the center for the global governance of chemicals, waste, and pollution, and the new science policy panel will support these international organizations and conventions. It is important that the legally binding instrument to end plastic pollution will address chemicals of concern and plastic products in a comprehensive manner. More transparency on the chemical composition of plastics is necessary in order to close current data gaps and to allow for a circular economy. The PlastChem project, through its report, puts forward an analysis that will help prioritize and address chemicals of concern. This is a critical step towards a circular economy and the protection of human health and the environment. I'm of course happy to see that the Swiss Federal Laboratories for Material Science and Technology are part of the PlastChem team and contributed to the report. So again, thanks and congratulations to the whole PlastChem team. And I wish you fruitful discussions on the latest state of science and on plastic chemicals of concern and the potential ways to address them. And wish everyone a good session and discussion today with the many important panel speakers that will contribute to this great session. And I thank you for the opportunity again and for your attention. Thank you very much.
Diana, sorry, you're muted.
So thank you very much, Michel, for your opening remarks. And moving on with this section of the event, it's now our pleasure to give the floor to Jonas Enge from the Research Council of Norway. Jonas, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I'll share my screen. So do you see it in full screen mode or do you see it presentation mode?
No, we see a presentation.
Okay.
We were not expecting. No, it's a presenter view. I'm sorry. We didn't know you had slides.
Sorry, I can do this orally. Let's do it orally. It's okay. No problem. Thank you very much for inviting me as a representative of the funding organization to give a brief introduction on the background of the PlastChem project. The Research Council of Norway is a government agency that funds research and innovation projects. On behalf of the government, we invest more than 1 billion euros annually. We are responsible for promoting both basic and applied research and innovation. And we have only one research council in Norway. The background of this call for proposals in 2022 was that the Environment Agency asked us to set up a call for proposals and provided the necessary funding for this. And this kind of call is similar to other calls for proposals that we do. For example, we have recent experiences with the versions of rapid reviews and synthesis reports and things like that. The call was set up to get a project on the state of the science review on hazardous substances in plastics in 2022. And the main objectives of the call was to provide new insights of concerns in plastics, on substances of concern in plastics, including on regulatory needs. And also to get a new knowledge base for policy development and decision-making at national, regional, and the global level. And this was a one-year project, which is completed in February 2024. We received 6 proposals to the call, and they were evaluated by an international panel of experts. We did what we usually do. We write a recommendation to the board, and the board decided to fund the PlastChem project. And what I can say from the international panel of experts is very descriptive of the project, I think. This proposal stood out among the group of proposals with its very clear description. They received the highest possible grade for scientific excellence. They showed a good understanding of context and policy interface. They showed also a clear and appropriate understanding of method to do the review. And last but not least, they had an exceptional project team. And during the one-year project, we had an advisory board consisting of the Research Council and the Environment Agency. We had 6 meetings with the project. So now to try to sum up and wrap up, this call was intended to provide scientific evidence to policymakers to deal with the chemical dimension of plastics. And I believe that with the PlastChem project, we have succeeded. So I would like to sincerely thank the excellent project team, the leader, Professor Martin Wagner, for their dedication and quality of work, and they delivered on time. So now, after following the lifetime of this super interesting and important project, I'm eager to learn more about the results and to follow the reactions and discussions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jonas, and thank you very much, Michelle, for the very inspiring kickoff for the discussion. And now, with no further ado, we're going to get into the heart of the conversation. Maybe a quick word. My name is David Azoulay. I'm from the Center for International Environmental Law. CL is one of the member and supporter organizer of the Geneva Beat Plastic Pollution. And while we've been having these conversations for, I think, close to 3 or 4 years now, I'm particularly delighted to host the stellar crew of presenter and debate and panelists that we will have today, because for those of you who know me, you'll know that my entry point into looking into plastic about 10 or 11 years ago was indeed the area of chemicals. So I am always excited and delighted when I see that kind of quality research coming out, and when it comes out in such a clear and powerful way, and at the timing that is absolutely perfect to have impact, it's even better. So with no further ado, we're now going to hear from 3 of the main authors of the PlastChem report, to hear about first about the findings, then about assessments of chemicals of concerns, and then about policy needs and key recommendation. To start with, it is my pleasure to welcome Laura Monclus, I hope I'm getting your name right, from the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, to talk to us about the core and main finding of this report. Laura, the floor is yours.
And I'm not Laura, but you will hear from Laura later on. Let me start.
Martin.
That's me, yes.
Martin, let me introduce you properly. You're an associate professor and an Onsager fellow on the Department of Biology in the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. And welcome, and the floor is now yours. Laura, your turn will come. I'm sorry that I mixed up the order.
We thought about mixing it up a bit today. Thank you so much. And let me start by thanking the fabulous Geneva Environment Network for hosting us, our fantastic speakers. I'm looking very much forward to the panelists and the panel discussion to get a diverse perspective on our report and on our findings. And of course, to all of you out there in front of your screens, thank you so much for joining us. As Jonas mentioned, we will present our State of the Science report on plastic chemicals today, research that has been funded by the Norwegian Research Council, and we're very grateful for providing for them to provide us with that funding. And I was blushing a bit when Jonas read out the reviews that we got. Thank you for that. So the goal of our work was really to synthesize the existing scientific knowledge to enable policymakers and other decision makers to identify chemicals and polymers of concern. And let me just, before we really dive deep into the science, let me just start with a culinary metaphor that a colleague of mine is using a lot when she tries to explain what plastics really are. And she's saying, imagine plastics really are like a spaghetti dish. So the spaghetti are the polymers, the major ingredient of all plastics. So these are very long molecules of repeating units we call monomers. And on a side note, just like spaghetti, if you boil them too hard, they will break down into tiny little bits and pieces. But if you have guests at home, you don't want to serve them with plain spaghetti. It's a bit dull, right? So you want to give them a nice little tasty dish of pasta. And for that, you need a tasty sauce with a lot of ingredients. And these are really the plastic chemicals that we're going to talk about today. Let's get a bit more serious, really, and take a more serious look at what plastic chemicals are. It's important really from the start to say plastic chemicals are not only plastic additives that we're usually talking about, because many of these plastic chemicals are used throughout the life cycle of plastic, starting from feedstock extraction. 99% of the carbon used in plastic is coming from fossil resources. Throughout the manufacture of plastics to the waste or the end of life stage. We're adding a lot of chemicals throughout that process. We're adding starting substances, monomers, catalysts to make the precursors. We're adding additives to the materials to make them functional. We're adding processing aids that help in the manufacture of these plastic materials and products. And importantly, throughout this whole life cycle of plastics, non-intentionally added substances are being generated or introduced in plastic materials and products. Now, why should one care about these plastic chemicals? Research is showing that many of these plastic chemicals are emitted or released to the environment throughout the whole life cycle of plastics. And that results in an exposure of wildlife and biota to these plastic chemicals. So research is also showing that the exposure to these kind of chemicals has substantial health impacts. So I'm just showing you here the results of a recent study that has been conducted in the US on the health impacts and the health costs of just a handful of plastic chemicals. So bisphenol A, for instance, phthalates used as plasticizers, and PFAS, and so on. So the researchers estimated that the human exposure to this handful of plastic chemicals amounts to health costs of $249 billion per year. And that's an immense price tag, right? So just to give you some context, that's about 1.2% of the US GDP. So for a handful of chemicals, we know that they have substantial health impacts. And the science is quite clear on that. And there's strong political momentum to deal with the plastics problem. I like to recall, I'm showing you an image here from the historic moment at Geneva 5, where countries passed a resolution to end plastic pollution. And it's very encouraging to see that many policymakers have understood that systemic change is needed to address that plastics problems of ours. And that includes the chemical dimension of plastics. And it also comes, I think, with a brighter vision for the future in such that we want to create safer and more sustainable plastics. So this is really encouraging. But plastic chemicals of concern are indeed a major roadblock in such a transition. And this is because there is so many plastic chemicals. A recent UNEP estimate said that there's more than 13,000 known plastic chemicals. And it's really so many, and what we are seeing if we look at the global governance of these chemicals is that very few of these chemicals are actually regulated on a global scale. So BRS in their report estimated that less than 1% of these chemicals is regulated globally. And again, the reason for that is very simple. It's simply too many plastic chemicals out there, so no country has the capacity to deal with them and gain regulatory control alone. And I think that provides quite strong motivation for a global multilateral action on plastic chemicals. So let's dive deeper into the science and see how we can help policymakers take evidence-based decisions towards a safer future for plastics. Laura, what are the key findings from our work?
Yeah, thank you, Martin. So in PlastChem, we found more plastic chemicals than previously known. We identify more than 16,000 plastic chemicals that are used or unintentionally present in plastic. And this increase in numbers compared to the previous report by UNEP is basically because we use more sources. We use a total of 7 databases, and the information gathered was updated to the spring of 2023. PlastChem does then harmonize previously fragmented information about plastic chemicals in one unique and comprehensive database, and highlights at the same time that the number and diversity of known plastic chemicals is immense. So not all of these chemicals are additives. And yeah, there is a bit of delay on the slide, sorry. So not all of these plastic chemicals are additives. On the contrary, the plastic chemicals identified here are very diverse and serve multiple functions, highlighting the complexity of chemicals in plastic. You may all be well aware of the well-known additives such as the plasticizers and the flame retardants, but there are many more chemicals that serve multiple functions. So we have, for instance, the processing aids, the starting substances like monomers, catalysts, and the NIAs, the non-intentionally added substances, which include degradation products and impurities. And all of them are relevant for human and environmental health. It is important to highlight that most plastic chemicals have a multitude of functions that cover multiple stages of the entirely plastic life cycle. So, if we focus on the potential exposure, we can see that despite we have these 16,000 plastic chemicals are used in plastic, we have additional robust information for more than 6,000 of them that are either marketed for use or present in plastic being detected in scientific studies. Importantly, for more than 9,000 chemicals, we simply do not have this information, and that shows that we are lacking transparency on plastic chemicals. So we are seeing that we have many plastic chemicals, and what we wanted is to identify which ones of them are chemicals of concern. So based on the United Nations globally harmonized system of classification and labeling and the updated CLP regulations, we applied 4 hazard criteria to identify chemicals of concern. And this is persistence, bioaccumulation, mobility, and toxicity. And we decided that 1 criterion is enough for classifying a chemical as chemical of concern. So following this hazard-based approach, we found more than 4,200 chemicals of concern. Another 1,200 are chemicals that are hazardous, but to a lesser degree. And only 161 chemicals are the ones that are classified as non-hazardous. However, none of them have been totally assessed for the 4 hazard criteria that I was telling you about. Therefore, on a scientific perspective, we cannot consider them as safe chemicals. Importantly, for more than 10,000 plastic chemicals, we do not have data, so therefore we don't know about their potential hazard properties. If we take a closer look at the hazard properties, we see that almost all plastic chemicals are toxic, half of them toxic for the aquatic environment, the other half toxic for human health. And here we can highlight the CMRs, so those chemicals that are carcinogens, mutagens, or toxic for reproduction. We gather less information for the other 3 criteria, so for persistence, bioaccumulation, and mobility. And on a side note, we can see here that we lack a hazard criterion for toxicity for the terrestrial environment, which may be very important to add in the future. So among these 4,000 chemicals of concern, we got additional evidence for the use and detection in plastic for 1,800. Most of them are marketed for the use, and almost 1,000 of them are present in plastic being detected in scientific studies. Here, it's very important to highlight that for more than 500 of them, we have evidence that they are released from plastic, indicating a high exposure potential. In addition, we also look at which plastic types these chemicals are found in. And indeed, we found that at least for 400 of them are used or have been detected in every major plastic type we have data for. And that includes, for instance, polypropylene, polystyrene, or polyethylene. Finally, we also look at how these chemicals are regulated on a global scale, and we updated the previous reports. PlastChem identified 980 chemicals that are currently regulated under existing multilateral environmental agreements. But it's important also to note that many of them are only regulated during parts of their life cycle. For instance, for the Basel Convention, it only covers plastic waste. So the global governance gaps still persist. So Martin, can you explain us how can we deal with so many plastic chemicals?
Thank you so much, Laura. And there's like two ideas and two kind of approaches that we decided on to address so many chemicals at once. And we decided to take a hazard-based approach and a group-based approach to deal with the multitude of plastic chemicals we identified in the project. I want to highlight that these two approaches are not new, and there is precedence in existing multilateral environment agreements to using these approaches. For instance, in the Stockholm Conventions, groups of chemicals are being addressed. So first, let's take a look at the hazard-based approach. So that approach follows the simple idea to identify chemicals of concern based on their intrinsic problematic properties. And as Laura explained, we used persistence, so the lack of degradation of a chemical, bioaccumulation, so they build up in organisms, including humans, mobility, so chemicals that would spread easily in the environment, in particular in drinking water systems relevant for human health, and then the big criterion of toxicity. So we use those four criteria to identify chemicals of concern in our project. And this approach is really backed by a lot of scientific evidence because there is abundant evidence for the release, exposure, and impacts of plastic chemicals. I must highlight that the hazard-based approach we took contrasts with the classical risk-based approach, and we found that approach not to be feasible for dealing with so many plastic chemicals. It requires a lot of resources, in particular to gain exposure information on 16,000 chemicals seems like an insurmountable task that might result in a delay of political decisions. So that provided us with strong arguments to take this hazard-based approach. So we applied this approach to create lists of chemicals of concern and other plastic chemicals that policymakers can use. And I'll talk you through that list-based approach. First, we identified chemicals that are already regulated under existing MEAs, multilateral environment agreements, such as Stockholm or Basel Convention. 980 chemicals are already being dealt with, but as Laura pointed out, some of the conventions, some of the MEAs only deal with a particular phase of the life cycle, the waste, for instance. So these chemicals are already regulated on a global scale. Then we isolated the 10,000 chemicals that did not have hazard data associated with it in the public domain accessible to us, and we put them on what we call a gray list. And in the report, we recommend strategies on how to prioritize these chemicals for testing and assessment. We then moved on with the chemicals we had hazard information on, and from those we built 4 lists that policymakers may wish to use. Most importantly, we put chemicals of concern, 3,600 of them currently not regulated on a global level, on the red list. And these deserve the highest priority for political decisions and political actions. We then built 2 lists of orange list chemicals that are less hazardous, and a watch list of chemicals that are currently under assessment. And we suggest, again, strategies on how to prioritize these chemicals in a policy context. And then we ended up with a very short white list of chemicals that have been classified as being not hazardous at all, but as Laura explained before, we are lacking some hazard information even on those chemicals, so policymakers may wish to prioritize these for further assessment. Moving on to the group-based approach, again, the idea is quite simple. The idea of that approach is to address groups of chemicals of concern instead of individual chemicals. And again, this is backed by the scientific evidence because we know that a similar chemical structure often comes with similar hazard properties. So there's scientific evidence to back such an approach. As I said, there's precedence for that in other MEAs, and we believe such a group-based approach will also incentivize safer designs of chemicals and avoid what we call regrettable substitutions, because it takes away the opportunity to use problematic chemical structures. Again, similar to the hazard-based approach, that group-based approach contrasts the traditional way of looking at one chemical at a time and will really fast-track regulation of chemicals. We applied that approach to our plastic chemicals, and we identified 15 priority groups of chemicals of concern based on like how many individual chemicals of concern these groups contain. And if you look at those 15 groups of chemicals, you might recognize some very kind of well-known examples here, for instance, bisphenols and phthalates, known for their human health effects, but also their impacts on the aquatic environment. You might recognize the PFASs, infamously known for their high persistence. But what we discovered in the report is that there's also many other groups of chemicals that are of concern that have gone under the radar, if I may say. For instance, aromatic amines, 100% of these chemicals, all of these chemicals are very hazardous according to our data. So the approach highlights really that there's other groups of chemicals that deserve our attention. So, looking at all the evidence that we compiled in the State of the Science report, I understand it's technical, it's detailed, it sounds complicated. Jane, what can policymakers do with that scientific evidence?
Thank you very much, Martin. So based on the state of the science on plastic chemicals, we would like to highlight 3 key principles that we consider the most important for dealing with plastic chemicals. And these principles are the precautionary principle, the full life cycle approach, and the principle of independent evidence. And under the umbrella of these 3 principles, we have 4 recommendations that we would like to share with policymakers based on the evidence. So the first recommendation deals with the fact that there are very, very many plastic chemicals, over 16,000. And so our recommendation here is to regulate plastic chemicals comprehensively and efficiently. And picking up on what Martin explained, we suggest to implement both a hazard-based and a group-based approach to comprehensively and efficiently deal with the plastic chemicals. This will require setting criteria to identify chemicals of concern, as we have done in this report. So these criteria can be used immediately. And then we also would like to recommend that the different lists, the prioritized lists of chemicals of concern and the groups are regulated. The second point addresses the fact that there are many unknown plastic chemicals. This includes, of course, also the non-intentionally added substances and also intentionally added chemicals. And so what we recommend here is to require transparency on plastic chemicals, addressing the chemicals that are intentionally used, where we would like to establish common information requirements, but also addressing the non-intentionally added substances. And this could, for example, be done by establishing a common platform for sharing information, so that not this intensive work, time-consuming and technically very demanding work on identification of the non-intentionally added substances can be shared. We also would like to recommend a requirement for disclosure and clear labeling of plastic chemicals of concern across entire value chains, and to promote gathering and disclosing of information on the complex mixtures. And that brings me to the third point, which is this chemical complexity. Plastics are always chemically highly complex materials consisting of many, many different types of chemicals intentionally used and also the non-intentionally added substances. And in order to address these, we strongly recommend simplification. So to simplify plastic materials towards safety and sustainability. And this can be achieved by developing stringent safety and sustainability criteria for plastic chemicals and materials, which need to be based on robust science, to develop clear guidelines and goals for achieving chemical simplicity in plastics, for example, design criteria, and to promote research and development into innovation for simpler and equally functional plastic materials. And with that, I would like to end on the fourth recommendation, which addresses the fact that oftentimes capacity is lacking to deal with plastic chemicals. And here we recommend to build this capacity so that safer and more sustainable plastics can be created in all countries, in all member states across the world. And this can be achieved by establishing open knowledge sharing platforms, by establishing an open forum for stakeholder dialogue involving stakeholders from industry, but also academia, of course, and civil society and governments, to provide resources for capacity building. This is especially important in those member states where this capacity building has not taken place sufficiently, but it's also important to build institutional capacity in many highly industrialized and developed countries where this capacity is also currently lacking. And last but not least, to leverage international cooperation. So together, this problem can be tackled. And with that, I would like to hand over to you, Martin. What have we learned today?
Thank you so much. We understand that it's a lot of information to take in. We compressed it in 25 minutes. You'll find more details, of course, in the report. So here's the 3 key messages that we want you to take home from this presentation and from the report. We expanded the universe of known plastic chemicals to over 16,000 chemicals that we know about. And these chemicals belong to multiple classes, serve multiple functions, are produced at substantial volumes. So there's a lot of chemical complexity out there, as Jane mentioned. We identified more than 3,600 plastic chemicals of concern that are currently not regulated globally. And these deserve the highest kind of priority when policymakers move forward with the Plastics Treaty, but also in regional and national policy making. We believe that a policy framework that is based on science can be applied to identify and prioritize these plastic chemicals of concern. It can be done, and the report outlines strategies and a framework how to do it based on the state of the science. So I'd like to close here. I would love to thank my amazing team that helped create that PlastChem report and the associated database. It was an immense pleasure to work with experts that have a combined expertise, I don't know, of decades of research on plastics and plastic chemicals. That was really fantastic. Thank you so much. I'd like to thank the Research Council of Norway again for providing the funding for producing that report. And I'd like to all of you to visit our website, where you can download the report and read it in detail, where you can also find the PlastChem database that contains all the information we talked about today and even more, so that you can use it. Thank you so much.
Well, Martin, Laura, Jane, thank you so very, very much for this presentation. It was both very comprehensive and also palatable and very accessible for everyone. So thank you very much. I hope there are some delegates in the room listening to us today, because I know policymakers always like to get their science in a way that is policy relevant, but not policy prescriptive. But really here, I find that what you've done beyond being prescriptive is being extremely useful, and you've really laid out a path of both what can be done and how it can be done. And I think this is something that delegates in the INC have been very much looking for. So thank you very, very much for this. We will now be moving to a panel discussion that will possibly be just as fascinating and interesting as the presentation that we've just heard. I want to remind all our participants that if you do have questions, there is a the Q&A question and answer box that you can access by clicking the little 3 dots that are in the bottom right corner of your screen, and by asking your questions there, the presenters that we've heard today would be able to respond in writing to your questions. And I invite Lara, Martin, and Jane to actually take a look at the Q&A question. There are some very interesting questions that I would be happy to read a response to. But now we're moving to our panel discussion, and we're joined by a number of absolutely fantastic experts, and I will try to give them prompt and introduce them as they come in. Our first panelist today is Karen Robenheimer, who is a lecturer at the Australian National Centre for Ocean Resource and Security of the University of Wollongong, but also best known as the writer or co-writer of many of the reports that have actually influenced and framed the thinking around the work of the INC. So thank you for joining us, Karen. Setting the stage, and based on your extensive experience, how do you see this new State of the Science report, this PlastChem report, advancing or being used in the negotiations?
Yeah, thanks, David. And just to echo my congratulations to the team, this is an excellent report. It really synthesizes the research on chemicals and polymers. It clearly lays out the issues, but also the mechanisms for better management of the plastic chemicals. Plastics and polymers, or chemicals and polymers, are included in the agreement at the moment, but it's a really difficult component for a lot of the negotiators at this stage. So I think this report's going to help tremendously with this aspect of negotiations. The draft agreement also has provisions that call for transparency and disclosure across the life cycle of plastics, including in trade. And this report has made it very clear that the transparency and disclosure is severely lacking. This really restricts our ability to understand the issues and to manage the issues. And I always say, it's much easier to manage pollution that you can see, but for pollution you can't see, you need really good data. So this report has made it clear that we need to focus on that in the agreement. The agreement also has placeholders for lists of chemicals and polymers at the moment. And then obviously different regulations would apply to those, such as elimination or restrictions on production, use, and trade. So this report has provided an excellent starting point for creating those lists. And negotiators can now actually have a picture of what those lists could look like, how to add to those lists, and how regulations that are being negotiated would apply to those lists. The support in creating those lists, to support that, there are options in the draft agreement that mention the grouping of chemicals approach. It's an important mechanism, I think, to accelerate our management of plastic chemicals, because we've seen from other MEAs that it's too slow to go chemical by chemical to add them to the listing in the agreements. So this report has provided a great mechanism to bring that to fruition, and that really speed up our ability to bring far more chemicals under global regulation a lot more quickly. And then finally, the draft agreement refers to product design, composition, and performance. And we heard mention here of design criteria. So the report provides strong support for design criteria and what they could look like. This will then help us move from that reactive approach that we currently have of trying to understand and manage plastic chemicals after they'd entered our markets. So this will help us move to a proactive approach where we seek to eliminate hazard before plastics are placed on the market. So again, a big congratulations. I think this report is going to be extremely helpful for many countries in negotiations. So back to you, David. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen. Our next speaker comes to us from UNEP, the United Nations Environment Programme. Marcos Yeridis is a chemical specialist with UNEP. So, Marcos, one of the things that I find really interesting with all of this is that this report, as was mentioned by the presentation, really builds on the 2023 UNEP technical report. The conclusions are very similar, although the numbers keeps on getting higher, and I suspect that if we do that again in 10 years, we'll have even higher numbers. And both report, as Karen was mentioning right now, really conclude that we continue to face major issues with access to information, even only to identify what chemicals are used, where, and in what quantity. So how do you see this new PlastChem new State of the Science report fostering action on transparency?
Thank you very much, David. And I'll also take the opportunity to congratulate the PlastChem team for an excellent report. Regarding your question about how the project can foster action on transparency, like Karen mentioned, it makes very clear the case that there is a need for more transparency, as you cannot regulate pollution that you cannot see, and also the suggestions about how to approach the screening of chemicals and to group chemicals, like Karen also said, can make the process much faster to identify potential chemicals or chemical groups that can be of concern. It's the report is also very much aligned with initiatives at UNEP that have also made it very clear that there is an increasing need for transparency along the value chain of plastic products. So in the chemicals in plastics report, it is also mentioned that it is necessary to increase transparency in order to address potential chemicals risks, but also the recommendation too of the project regarding transparency is also aligned with other recent work of UNEP. For example, it is among the key messages of the GEF-funded project, the Global Best Practices on Emerging Chemical Policy Issues of Concern under SAICHEM, which looked into upstream measures to address the issue of chemicals in products in electronics, building and toy products. The issue of transparency is also reflected in the 10 green sustainable chemistry objectives. It's also worth saying that an approach to having higher transparency along the value chain would facilitate safer plastic products, not only along the value chain and the lifetime of a single product, but along the lifetime of the material, or otherwise the lifetimes of multiple products making use of secondary material. So it would indirectly facilitate the circular economy of plastics. So there would be multiple benefits from higher transparency along the value chain. In this regard, the no data, no market policy approach is not an entirely novel and disjointed measure, but rather is aligned with the Basel and Stockholm Conventions, which advocate against the recycling of POP-containing plastics above a certain limit to avoid perpetuating the presence of POPs in products. The State of the Science report, as does the UNEP Chemicals in Plastics report, speaks to the importance of grouping approaches and indeed focusing on groups to address the great number of chemicals used in plastic production. And it's certainly an important aspect of moving forward. It's also worth mentioning that as stipulated in the Dubai Declaration on International Chemicals Management of 2006, information on chemicals relating to the health and safety of humans and the environment should not be regarded as confidential. So again, another argument for increased transparency. And also regarding UNEP initiatives, the newly adopted global framework on chemicals also sets as a key principle the need for access to relevant information on chemicals, their use, as well as to information in order to protect the human health and the environment. So to conclude, I think the message from the report makes a very clear case to increasing transparency, and is very much aligned with messages from other initiatives that looked into chemicals in products.
Thank you very much, Marcos. I think this is also very inspiring, and I heard you type on quite a number of key words there, whether it's the no data in the market, the circular economy, which we'll hear probably a little more from later speaker today. But so thank you very much. I'm now turning to WHO and Leslie Onion. You're the head of the Chemical Safety and Health Unit in the Department of Environment, Climate Change and Health at WHO. And WHO has been instrumental in fostering understanding of specific hazards and toxicity of some substances. Thinking, for example, of how WHO was really key in establishing that some of those chemicals, like lead, don't have any safe level of exposure, for example. And in addition to that, WHO now has a clear mandate from the World Health Assembly to actively engage in the plastic treaty negotiation. So how do you see WHO play that role of fostering not just a better understanding, but also better addressing of the health dimension of the plastic pollution along its life cycle in the negotiations?
Thanks, David, and thanks for those questions. But I also add my congratulations to the authors of the report. It's a very coherent and comprehensive report, which is quite refreshing to see. So congratulations to everybody involved in that. So in turning to your questions, David, given the mandate that the WHO has received from the World Health Assembly, our key roles are to increase the engagement of the health community in the treaty negotiations, and that's really improving awareness of the treaty negotiations and advocating for the health aspects of plastics to be strongly covered in the proposed treaty, specifically for the treaty to promote the attainment of the highest standard of health and environment amongst its core objectives. Thirdly, given the new mandate to scale up our own scientific and policy work on the health aspects of plastics. And I'd just like to use the time we have this afternoon to update you on some of the work we've been doing. In terms of the treaty negotiations, we have a few observations about some of the health aspects. Firstly, we see some of the more challenging aspects being the use of plastics in healthcare. And whilst we need to ensure access to safe and effective healthcare products, which are of good quality and affordable, accessible and appropriate, we do recognise there's a need to transform the healthcare sector to reduce plastic waste and pollution. So we hope that those two objectives can be mutually can act together rather than against each other. Secondly, recognising that plastics are made from products of the petrochemical industry, WHO would want the treaty to be very flexible, future-proofed, and to foster innovation in healthcare, aligning its objectives with those of the Alliance for Transformative Action on Climate and Health, with the aim of fostering sustainable and climate-resilient healthcare facilities. We see the issue of microplastics and nanoplastics and the leaching of problematic chemicals from plastics as a key issue in the treaty negotiations, and these are subjects of active review by WHO. Our current position is that whilst evidence is lacking for a full human health risk assessment, we do recognise that the evidence is growing rapidly and that reducing exposure to microplastics and nanoplastics is a precautionary measure that should be promoted in the treaty. Like we've heard from other speakers already this afternoon, we strongly support the treaty having very strong provisions for information exchange and transparency. So in the remaining time I have, I just want to give a little bit of an update on two technical initiatives of WHO that may be of interest to participants, recognising the mandate from the Health Assembly and calling us to scale up our own work. We're engaged in two reviews that would be of interest. One is the derivation of health-based guidance values for PFAS and related substances. And that work is being conducted in two phases. The first being a systematic landscape review to identify the key health effects and environmental occurrence in food and water, and then developing review protocols and methodologies to derive the health-based guidance values. And secondly, we're engaged together with UNEP on an update of the state of the science on endocrine disruptors. And this will provide an update for policymakers on the 2012 report of the same name. From WHO's perspective, we've already made good progress on this report. We've already conducted a scoping review of the published scientific literature, and not surprisingly found a threefold increase in studies published over the last 10 years with more than 30,000 studies. So we're also coordinating our efforts with those of the OECD and the GHS subcommittee and will likely identify and focus on those endpoints where the strength of evidence has grown further over the past 10 years, or as well as endpoints that are not included in the 2012 report, particularly those associated with the non-EATS pathways, for example, metabolic disorders, where there's an increased amount of evidence. So both of these initiatives are due for completion at the end of 2025, and we hope that they will also be able to serve a role in the treaty implementation. So thank you very much, David, for the opportunity to say a few words this afternoon.
Thanks very much, Leslie, and I feel there's a dynamic, there's a pattern here where we're saying so many organizations and so many speakers really focus and push in a similar kind of direction. And I find that very encouraging in the face of the challenges that we know the INC is facing. So I'm turning now to a speaker from another international organization, the OECD. Eva Leinola, you're the Principal Administrator on Risk Reduction, GLP and Mutual Acceptance of Data in the Chemical Accident Program. OECD has really been one of the early organizations looking to plastic chemicals in the context of sustainable plastic design or redesign, as we know they need to be redesigned. So how do you see this new report informing future design of safer and more sustainable plastics, and particularly from a policy regulator perspective? What can the policy and regulators can do, and how can they use this new report, or how do you foresee that they will use this new report?
Thanks, David, for the questions. So like others, I'd like to begin by thanking the project team for this really excellent report. It will certainly be a resource for everyone working on the plastics topic with a focus on chemicals. So I'd like to focus on three different points. So you mentioned the OECD's work on design of sustainable plastics. So in 2021, we released a report on chemicals perspective on designing with sustainable plastics. And really in that report, we were looking to embed sustainable chemistry thinking at the design stage of plastics. So how do we drive more conscious considerations of the impacts of chemicals that are selected? And within that report, we articulated some sustainable design goals. So one was to select materials with an inherently lower risk or hazard. The second was to select materials that have a commercial afterlife. The third was to select materials that generate no waste. and finally, to select materials that use secondary feedstock or bio-based feedstocks. Those goals are much more elaborated within the report. Also recognizes that in considering these design goals and also the product design goals of a company, there can be burden shifting and trade-offs that will arise. And these burdens or shifts are not always the same for all products. And resolving these trade-offs is not always easy or it doesn't always have simple answers. But taking all these different elements into consideration, a more systems approach will ultimately lead to better decision making. So today's State of the Science report that was released certainly aids in informing the hazard and the transparency aspects of sustainable design of plastics, but also includes several similar messages about design. Also, many of the chemical groups that were identified include substances that are regulated at a national level, if not at an international level. But when we think about the international flow of plastics, it also brings to fore the question of ensuring both consistent global risk management, but also creating a level playing field for progressive industry so that they can compete in a global market. Also, industry with less technical capacity needs concrete information, such as is provided with this project, to help them make better chemical selection choices. So all the information compiled here will help. Secondly, I want to point out that I think many people here are extremely aware of this, but so globally there is extensive experience in chemicals management, and we need to continue to leverage this. So in terms of synthesizing information, using already completed assessments of others and not duplicating. And that's certainly something that this project has done, but that we need to continue doing moving forward as we fill many of the data gaps that were highlighted. Also, particularly when we're thinking about comparing chemicals in specific product streams or by functionality, there's also an opportunity to utilize really an abundance of tools that have been developed in the field of alternatives assessment and substitution. So while those tools typically looking at comparative hazard and comparative exposure information, they lend themselves quite well in thinking about the issue of chemicals and plastics. And thirdly, I think to support international harmonization regarding chemicals management, we also need to work together to ensure that all countries have in place national chemical management systems. This was really emphasized in the recent global framework on chemicals. So to have legislation and frameworks suitable for the chemical industry within their countries. But this enables comprehensive chemicals management approach as new chemicals continue to come to market, but it can also then support the international actions on managing chemicals and plastics. So to close, I think plastics are certainly complex because, well, you heard about the number of chemicals that are used, but also because they serve many different uses. So from consumer plastics to industrial to single-use or short-lived ones to ones that have long durability. So all these require different types of formulations. So we need to really, I think, bring together various risk management approaches and levers for chemical management in plastics. So some of these can be regulation-based at international or national levels, but we also need to create the conditions that incentivize industry to prioritize more sustainable design of plastics by really consciously thinking about the impacts of the chemicals that they select to deliver the desired functionalities that they're looking for. So congratulations again to the team for this excellent work. And it'll be a lot more work ahead as well for all of us in this field, but it's a great contribution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eva. We're now moving to Hans-Peter Ark. I'm sorry. You're an environmental chemist with the Norwegian Geotechnical Institute. And I know that you've been particularly interested in looking into aspects relating to the circular economy. And this report identifies such a large number of toxic plastic chemicals, and they obviously have an impact, I would say severe impact on the life cycle and the potential circularity of plastics, that led some people to claim that there is no such thing as a circular plastic anymore because of that toxicity. So what would be your key recommendations to move towards a safer and more sustainable circular economy from your scientific perspective, who's been at the crossroad of science and policy for quite some time?
Yeah, well, no, thanks for that very interesting question. I have been looking at this question of circularity of plastics and the circular economy in general, which I'm still hoping for. I'm still hoping we can achieve an economy that uses less resources. But, you know, as a scientist, I've always been seeing that dilemma about how hazardous substances are not directly compatible with the circular economy. You know, with my kids and my wife, we like to go thrift shopping, get some old toys or maybe some bottles, but then I might see that bottle has plastic carbonate and polycarbonate and might have bisphenol A. And so I'm like, I don't even know, these were before we had regulations about these chemicals in that plastic. So that's just an immediate example that came to my mind early on about the crossroads, as you say, about hazardous chemicals and circular economy. And then, but I've been researching solutions, but what struck me a lot about the PlastChem report and the work that we've been doing there was just how large the number of chemicals concerned have become and how hard it is to control. And I'm thinking also about how the circular economy can introduce new exposure routes that are extremely challenging as a scientist to model. Like, for instance, the hazardous conditions in recycling factories around the world. We don't know what people are breathing in those places anymore. And plastics that are not really sort of for recycling, it's just put that way and they end up in landfills. And it just seemed to me the way this all became this big Pandora's box of increasing chemicals of concern, increasing exposure pathways introduced by the circular economy. The only way is forward is something we've been talking about a lot, and that is to incentivize simplification, incentivize innovation towards a safer and more sustainable plastics industry that is more compatible with the circular economy. And that does simplify everything, you know, from simplify the cycle, the life cycle, such as whereas plastics are essential, try to recycle them locally in your country with maybe more high quality materials that can withstand being reused. And also also in those examples in plastics in general, we want to transition to fewer substances that are easy for us to understand their risks. And from the PlastChem report, we can talk about negative lists of chemicals we just maybe don't want to see in general, but also positive lists for certain uses are also possible. And just to give you an example from the report, when I see that it's 3,674 colorants in plastic, and many of them have a hazard, and maybe they don't serve a functional purpose other than as a pigment, and that's not compatible really with, if you want to say, with mechanical recycling, control the color. So it's reducing like which of those pigments are truly essential and the least hazardous for a certain use. So that would be how to go there. And so this is the type of thinking that has to go forward: simplify the life cycle, simplify the materials, and simplify the chemicals. And I think we have to look at market incentives and try to find innovation, how these new life cycle and say more local value cycles can be achieved, also within the context of a clear international framework that sets these goals towards these simplification of materials, life cycles, and chemicals. So that's it. Incentivize simplification.
Thank you very much, Hans-Peter. I think this was very good. So now, I'm sorry. We've heard from regulatory agencies, international organizations. We've heard from the scientists quite a lot. I feel like it's time to put our industry friends on the spot. I will now turn to Jody Roussel, who is the Global Public Affairs Lead for Packaging and Sustainability at Nestlé. Nestlé is also a key member of the Business Coalition for a Plastic Treaty. And I think, Jody, you will be speaking on behalf of more of the Business Coalition than just Nestlé, but I know your long experience will inform that. So, we've heard about all of the challenges and all of the ways regulators and scientists are hoping to advance this question. So building upon the finding of the report, how is the Business Coalition and its members taking actions to remove chemicals of concerns in plastic and just simply enhance transparency?
Thanks very much, David, for the question. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, super.
Yes.
So I'll speak about this from the Business Coalition, but I'll give you some examples as well from Nestlé's experience. Leading up to the INC4, the Business Coalition published 5 policy briefings. One of them was on restrictions and phase-outs, covering chemicals and polymers of concern, as well as problematic and avoidable plastic products. When we look at the treaty, we're hoping that there'll be alignment on binding, harmonized criteria, that the annexes will provide space for the development of specific lists of chemicals, groups of polymers, and chemicals that should be phased out, inclusion of harmonized information disclosure, marking, and labeling requirements. Now, why is this important? If I reflect on this and the path we have ahead of us in the roughly 80 to 85 hours of negotiation time that's planned, it's important to link chemicals to specific applications and products in specific industries, and to focus the remit of work industry by industry. Applications are complex, and an application that may be difficult in one industry may not in another. There's a lot of voluntary progress already being made to date by a group of self-selecting companies. And we certainly appreciate the earlier comments about leveling for the playing field for the companies who are already making investments and changes to their portfolio. I think about the Consumer Goods Forum's Golden Design Rules, of which Nestlé and many other Business Coalition members are a part. Nestlé's negative list, which is publicly available, about materials that have already been targeted for phase out or have been phased out. But it's unrealistic in the scope of the treaty to complete all of this work on what is a broad and deep and very important topic by the end of November. And as long as the treaty framework provides space for a management process, we see that the work could be managed between a diplomatic conference and the first COP in terms of getting into details. We also think it's really important to consider how to tap the experience and expertise, a lot of which we've seen shared on the call today, in order to get the right mix of solutions for each of the timeframes and the opportunities those timeframes present ahead. The rest of the year with the negotiations foreseen, the window before the diplomatic conference, and the window between the diplomatic conference and the first COP. We can take a start and strengthen approach, and in the Business Coalition, we see that as pragmatic and actionable. But at the same time, we don't see there's any need to wait to apply established and well agreed on industry-specific lists that everyone already has agreed on and many companies have already taken action on. So concluding from a business point of view, I'll summarize. It's important to avoid vastly diverging elimination criteria and lists developed by governments, unnecessary loopholes for the trade of items that are banned in one country but not another, and thirdly, increased administrative burdens of purely national rules and intensive border control measures. Coordinated efforts on elimination will help us do 3 things. One of them is reduce compliance risks for business. Secondly, to decrease contamination in recycling processes. And thirdly, increase the safety and quality of all plastic products and the recycled feedstock for all industries. If you're interested, you can download the policy briefing we have prepared on chemicals and polymers of concern and problematic and avoidable plastic products. We look forward in going into detail into the new report that's been presented today and taking that into consideration in our future positions. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Jody. And I'm hearing a true and deep plea, business and industry plea for the treaty to actually address in a way that is globally coordinated chemicals of concerns and the toxicity of all plastics being used, and that is very welcome to hear. And again, I'm hoping that our delegates and negotiators are listening to us, are listening to you, and are taking notes. Before I move to our last two speakers, I want to remind everyone that there's a Q&A box that you can access by clicking the three little dots in the bottom right of your screen. There are a lot of very interesting questions. Our panelists have been working very hard in responding to many of those questions. So even if you're not interested, if you don't have a question to ask, you might find a lot of very valuable additional information in the back and forth between the participants and our panelists there. And that allows me to turn now to Jianyun Wang. You are with the EMPA that was praised by our opening speaker, by Michel, earlier on. There are a lot of questions in the chat and some questions that were raised before about the hazard-based, group-based approach to chemical management. Now, this is not really new, as we've heard in the presentation, but I'd like to hear from you, why does it matter, particularly in the context of plastic chemicals, and what are the advantages of using these two core approaches to addressing plastic chemicals? Or yeah, plastic chemicals. Jianyun.
Yes. The following 3 points as some food for thought. So first, I think I would also like to echo the previous speakers that a hazard-based and a group-based approach to chemicals management has been successfully applied at the national, regional, and global levels. So most importantly, this approach has enabled us to address a lot of highly problematic chemicals in a very efficient manner. So we have the necessary tools and experience in further applying this approach to plastic chemicals. Second, I would like also to clarify that using a hazard-based, group-based approach is not only for efficiency. So this is very important, the efficiency, as we have heard from the Hans-Peter, that currently it is very difficult to understand where the chemicals are in which plastics. So it is very difficult to take a risk-based approach to identify them for action. And I would also like to highlight that it is actually a necessity to use a hazard-based, group-based approach for protecting human health and the environment, as well as for solving the plastic pollution issue. This is because when we take our time to identify chemicals of concern, taking actions, people are being exposed to the chemicals. Vulnerable and at-risk populations are being exposed, and our reuse and recycling systems are being impeded. So this does not mean that we do not need any other information when addressing plastic chemicals. In fact, once we identify and decide to act on chemicals of concern based on a hazard-based and group-based approach, exposure information is key for developing and taking effective action to remove chemicals of concern from the products that we and our technological systems are being exposed to. I very much agree with the previous speakers on the critical needs for the transparency and also that we need to use the information we have in a most efficient and fit for purpose way. Third, I would also like to highlight that as Eva said before, a hazard-based, group-based approach can not only help us to address the legacy and emerging and more plastic chemicals and plastic products. The approach can inform the chemical and product designers to early on move away from certain bad chemicals and thus stimulate safe and more sustainable plastics. financial and human resources that our societies have. So in turn, this can also help to build the consumers' confidence on the brands and product safety in general. So I would just like to reiterate, so we do have the tools and experience in applying a hazard and group-based approach to plastic chemicals. It is not only for efficiency, but a necessity for protecting human health and the environment, as well as for solving the plastic pollution issues. And it can also guide us towards safer and more sustainable plastic chemicals. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Janyun. So I'm now turning to the last speaker of our panel, Ana Paula Souza. You're a human rights officer at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And we wanted to have you speak last on the panel because we at CL, and I think many in the panel and the organization thought and consider that human rights is really a key lens to look at this particular questions of plastics and toxicity. The impacts on human rights throughout the life cycle of plastic have been quite well documented, including by a very good report by the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Toxics. And this report really just adds to the evidence. Now, in parallel to this, during the negotiation, both leading to the mandate adoption and at INC 1, 2, and 3, we've heard many countries call for a rights-based approach for the treaty. So if you had 3, you can give us 4 if you have 4 recommendations to operationalize, in particular, this rights-based approach in the future instrument, what would this be?
Thank you so much, David. And allow me to join others in congratulating the launch of this report, this important and timely report. First, I would like to note that OHCHR and also the Special Rapporteur on Toxic and Human Rights have also been calling for a move from a chemicals-specific approach to addressing groups of chemicals of concern. This could help to ensure that restrictions of one harmful chemical does not simply lead to the substitution of another harmful chemical, and in doing so, better safeguard the rights that are compromised by toxic exposure. This also must be accompanied by a cap on primary plastic production and measures to eliminate and restrict unnecessary, avoidable, or problematic plastics, as well as the plastic polymers that are of particular concern due to the adverse effects on the environment and human health. The lack of transparency, which has been highlighted in this study and by many of the fellow speakers, and that is closely linked to accountability, is another priority that we have been highlighting at INC. Access to information must ensure full transparency related to health and safety information and not be subject or conditional to industry interests. Top 3 recommendations, David. This is a hard task, but for the benefit of time, I will prioritize the recommendations most related to the issues discussed here. As we know, in negotiations, every comma is fiercely scrutinized. That means that what is excluded from the text matters as much as what has been included. And human rights matter. As this study points out, chemicals of concern are present in all plastics types. If plastics were a sample in a laboratory or a piece in a museum with little to no interaction with people in the environment, it would not have been a human rights issue. And most likely we would not have been, there is be a need for a treaty to end plastic pollution. But we know this is not the case. Plastics are accumulating in food chains, contaminating water, soil, and air, and releasing hazardous substances into the environment, with disproportionate impacts in several populations. So David, the first recommendation is a plastic treaty with explicit reference to human rights is a matter of obligation, as all states already have those obligations to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights. This extends to protecting people from foreseeable and preventable human rights harms caused by all forms of environmental degradation, including plastic pollution. The treaty must also safeguard the rights of those most affected by plastic production and pollution. This needs to be spelled out. And then while there is much attention about how the business sector is an integral part of the solutions to address plastic pollution, which no one here will disagree to that, their responsibility for creating massive volumes of plastic pollution and waste is often not part of the discussion. The second recommendation is for the new instrument, in line with the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, to include an obligation requiring states to enact mandatory human rights due diligence laws and transparency, which would require enterprises to disclose the full chemical composition of their plastic materials and products, including additives, and traceability across the value chain of plastic products, plastic trade flows, supply chains, and trade policies. Policymaking must be informed by the best available science, and a diverse range of voices must be involved in informing environmental policy. For this to happen, some conditions must be in place. There should be an enabling environment for the conduct of scientific inquiry, free from undue interference, conflict of interest, and misleading claims related to plastic pollution. Governments should fund research and ensure equitable access to sustainable technologies through international cooperation. So the third and final recommendation for the purpose of this panel and the benefit of time is for the new treaty to protect the right to science, including indigenous people's rights to their knowledge, practices, and innovations. Thank you, David.
Thank you very much, Ana Paula. I think this was a very good way to wrap up the conversation. And I want to extend additional thanks to all our panelists who, in addition to having provided some very useful insights from their perspective into the value and expanded, I would say, the value of the report for the treaty and for negotiations, have also all stick to the 3 minutes time limit that I had asked them to stick to, and that is probably even more exceptional and more rare than a clean, safe, and sustainable plastic. So really, thank you very much for all of you on that. And I want to thank again all of the authors of the PlastChem report, those that we saw on screen today, as well as those who have been working on the report but who have not appeared in our webinar today. This is really a great work that goes both in depth of the technical aspects of the knowledge, what we need to know, but again, and I'm repeating myself, but I think this is really important to thank you for that, putting that and packaging all that knowledge and information in a way that is not only accessible, but really useful for negotiators of the plastic treaty. So thank you again and congratulations again. We're about to close this webinar now, but before we close for good, I would like to give the floor back to Diana from the Gen, who's going to tell us about all the future great other webinars and initiatives that Gen is organizing and or supporting. So Diana, thank you again for all the organization. Thanks to you and thanks to all of your team for a flawless and technical aspects of this. Thanks also to all the participants. I forgot to say that, for your active responses in the chat, and thanks to all of our audience who have been asking and making this webinar even more interesting through the interaction, direct interaction with the authors in the chat. So thank you very much to all of you. Thanks, Diana and the Gen team. Diana, you have the last words.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you also for the moderation of this session. Congratulations once more to the authors of the report. We heard the comment about how this report is useful for who is negotiating, and I think we all join this. All hope to have an ambitious outcome of the upcoming session of the INC. So wishing also all of you a lot of luck there. But we will see each other again, because we have 3 scheduled sessions before the INC, 4 even more will come before the INC meets in Ottawa. So as you will see in the upcoming slides, we have a session on, and I'm looking at my colleagues for their moving. Next week we are meeting again for the presentation of the report that Grid Arendal has prepared. looking at the global actions to stem climate change and end plastic pollution, so the climate impacts of plastics, that complements other reports that have been issued in the past. So join us next Wednesday at 2 p.m. also on WebEx. The link will be shared in the chat. And the week after, we are also joining our colleagues from IUCN, discussing biodiversity and the treaty. How can biodiversity and how should it or not be implemented or included in the text? So this will take place on the 26th of March, also at lunchtime for who is based in Geneva. Other time zones for who is joining us from other parts of the planet. And in April, on the 9th of April, we plan also to be back with the trade community, with our colleagues from the World Trade Organization to present what they have done at WTO concerning to plastics linked to the ministerial statement that was made at the latest ministerial conference that took place a couple of weeks ago. So with that, we hope to see you at the upcoming sessions, if those are of interest for you, of the Geneva Plastic Pollution Dialogues. And we thank you all again. And just as we keep getting these questions again and again, the video is already available on the webpage of the event. The summary will be there available, and the presentations that were made, the links to this excellent report are all available on the webpage of the event. So don't hesitate to get back there. So thank you all who have been involved in making this event possible, and also all those not only who made the report, but behind the scene, those who are funding this type of research that can all help us taking ambitious actions for our planet. Thank you very much.